The stars hummed in a chorus of distant lights, painting the sky with a faint glow of ancient cosmic battles. Amidst this eternal dance, the world of Elora thrummed with tension. Its people, an elven race of silvery hair and piercing blue eyes, were an ancient civilization bound by arcane secrets. But it was not the mighty warriors nor the high priestesses who would make history this day. In the shadows of a towering basalt spire, hidden beneath the cloak of night, a young girl sat with her back pressed against the jagged stone. Her hair, moon-white and unkempt, fell around her in a silken curtain as she hugged her knees to her chest. She was Aelara, daughter of the High Seer, and tonight she was crying, not out of fear, but of rage and betrayal. Aelara's tears caught the slivers of moonlight as they traced paths down her pale cheeks, each drop a story of confusion and loss. Her once guardian, the High Council, had branded her an outcast after an incident that shook their foundations, a vision of a future where Elora's greatest enemy would be its own people, a civil war fueled by greed and forbidden magic. "You are weak," spat her sister, Zyreth, now one of the dark elves who had embraced the forbidden path. "Your vision was a lie, a curse. You have no right to speak of it." But Aelara knew it was real. The vision still burned behind her closed eyes. She knew the storm that would consume them was approaching. And now, with her own kind turning away from her, she had nowhere to turn. The dark elves, with their obsidian eyes and faces carved in a perpetual scowl, were closing in on her like wolves surrounding prey. Suddenly, a whisper carried through the air, a strange sound, unlike the voice of wind or the murmur of starlit leaves. It was a human voice, clear and full of defiance. "Step away from her," the voice commanded. Aelara's eyes snapped open, and through her blur of tears, she saw him. A human, standing tall in the clearing, armor glistening in the moon's pale light. His hair was a dark river, braided in the style of the old warriors, and his eyes were fierce with a defiant fire that made the dark elves hesitate. "What is this?" Zyreth snarled, looking from Aelara to the stranger. "I am Caleb," the human said, his voice low, filled with something she couldn't name, an echo of warmth and resolve. "And I am here to take her home." Aelara's breath caught in her throat. A human, not a soldier from the realms of war, but one who had dared to cross the forbidden frontier between their worlds. He must have been a mercenary, a wandering soul who had braved Elora's treacherous woods. Yet, he stood with a confidence that made even the dark elves falter. Zyreth, whose eyes had flickered with doubt, raised her blade. A shimmer of dark magic laced the air, making the surrounding woods shudder and groan. "You're a fool, Caleb. She's ours. Always was. And you," her gaze turned sharp as she pointed at Aelara, "will never escape the fate you've carved for yourself." But Caleb stepped forward, unafraid. His hand, strong and calloused, moved with the fluidity of an ancient protector as he drew a sword from his back. The blade hummed with a light unknown to Elora, forged not of star metal or sorcery, but of something deeper, older, and stronger. "No," Caleb whispered. "She's not yours. She's the only hope we have left." The dark elves shifted, their weapons a glinting menace. Yet, Aelara could see the uncertainty in their eyes. For the first time, they saw the human not as an invader, but as a force. And then the silence shattered as the battle erupted. Aelara watched in awe as Caleb moved through them, swift and relentless. His sword cut not with the precision of magic, but with the raw power of will and defiance. Aelara felt something shift inside her, a spark long dormant reawakening. The vision had spoken of war, yes, but it had also whispered of hope. For even in the darkest heart of battle, it was not fear or hatred that carried the day, but courage. The fighting stilled. The dark elves watched, their expressions unreadable as the last echoes of the battle faded. Aelara glanced up at Caleb, who, with eyes that spoke of both triumph and exhaustion, lowered his sword. "You're free," he said, turning to her with a smile that made her chest ache. "But you're not alone anymore." Tears streamed down her face, not in sorrow, but in disbelief. The night sky held its breath, the stars their eternal vigil. For the first time, hope was not just a whisper. It was a roar. And Aelara, once an outcast, found herself not just saved, but reborn. Aelara's breath came in shuddering gasps as the first light of dawn crept over the jagged mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The forest, a world she had known all her life, felt different now, less a sanctuary and more an uncharted realm where hope and fear intertwined. The echoes of battle had faded, but the memory of Caleb's defiance still pulsed in her mind. "Are you all right?" Caleb's voice, calm and steady, pulled her from the stillness. He stood a few paces away, his sword sheathed and his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her shiver. His armor, still flecked with dark blood, was a stark contrast against the delicate silvery light of the morning. Aelara nodded, though she felt far from all right. She looked at the dark elves, now tied and kneeling in a semicircle around them. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions unreadable. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. "You did what needed to be done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a rawness to it, an honesty that stung as much as it reassured. Caleb moved closer, glancing at the captives and then back to Aelara. "They won't follow us if we take them to the Monolith. It's a place of power. They'll be bound to its will until they're judged." Aelara shivered, but not from fear. The Monolith was a forgotten relic, older than even the High Seer's line, a place where the fates of all who entered were sealed. "Then we need to go," she said, her voice stronger now, a tremor of resolve tracing each syllable. "The High Council will have sent scouts by now. We don't have much time." He nodded and took her hand, warm and reassuring. His touch was so unexpected, so real, that she almost flinched. The idea that a human would save her, an elven princess ostracized for her vision, was a contradiction she could hardly fathom. But in Caleb's presence, the weight of her own doubts began to lift. They traveled through the woods, their path silent save for the whispered conversations of leaves and the distant calls of birds that were just waking. Aelara's mind, ever sharp, wandered back to the vision she had seen in the depths of the sacred chamber, a vision filled with chaos, torn banners, and betrayal. But what struck her most was the glimmer of silver hair she'd glimpsed, a figure who would emerge from the flames and lead the elven people into a new dawn. The vision had always been shrouded in confusion, but now it was clear. Caleb had been there, a beacon against the dark. They came to the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to a clearing that housed the Monolith. Its stone was cold and cracked, etched with runes that pulsed with a ghostly light. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries, of truths buried beneath the earth and time. Aelara's heart thudded in her chest as they approached. This was the place where her future would be decided, where enemies would be tested and alliances forged or shattered. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said, looking up at Caleb. His eyes met hers, unwavering. "That we're standing at the crossroads," he said. "But for the first time, we don't have to face it alone." Aelara took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The echoes of the past and the doubts that had haunted her were now tinged with a new, vibrant hope. The Monolith seemed to listen, its runes flickering with an ancient response, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The dark elves, now subdued and bound, looked to the stone with hollow eyes, sensing the power it wielded. Caleb stepped forward, his voice resolute. "Monolith of Elora, witness these who seek judgment. Bind them, and let them be judged by the fates. May this be the first act of a future reclaimed." The air thickened, and a low rumble resonated from the stone, growing into a crescendo that filled the clearing. The runes, once dark and cracked, gleamed with a light that held both danger and promise. Aelara watched in awe as tendrils of shimmering energy reached out, enveloping the captives. A muted cry escaped one of them before their forms were wrapped in bindings of light, as if the monolith itself had woven chains of fate. Aelara turned to Caleb, who now stood beside her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The bond between them had shifted from mere strangers to something stronger, an alliance, perhaps, or something deeper that even Aelara didn't yet understand. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Caleb said, his eyes bright as dawn's first light. "We did it." With that, Aelara allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. For the first time in her life, the vision of a shattered Elora seemed less like a prophecy of doom and more like a warning, a challenge. And in the heart of that warning, there was a promise that even in the darkest of times, salvation could come from the most unexpected places. The wind carried their shared silence, weaving it into the fabric of the world. As the monolith's light faded and the forest slowly came alive with the songs of the new day. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the forest canopy, but the air still held the chill of the night's battle. Aelara's legs ached from the trek, her skin damp with the damp dew of morning and the heat of exertion. Caleb had kept pace with her, always just a few steps away. Though his armor was stained with blood, his eyes were sharp, alert, and unyielding. They had bound the dark elves to the monolith's will, but their journey was far from over. The High Council would not take the turn of events lightly. Elora's history was one of defiance, but it had never witnessed the rise of a human savior in its midst. Aelara could already imagine the uproar among the nobles and the accusations that would fly. The question wasn't whether they would be hunted, but when. "We need to get to the seer's refuge," Caleb said, breaking the silence as they reached the crest of a hill. The landscape rolled out before them, a sea of emerald and silver, glistening with the light of morning. "It's the only place where we'll be safe long enough to plan our next move." Aelara met his gaze. The intensity of his eyes had grown sharper, darker, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on him. "Do you really think the refuge will hold against them?" she asked, the wind catching her hair and twisting it around her face. Caleb's jaw clenched. "For a while, long enough to rally those who still believe in the old ways." His voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name, but the determination was plain. Aelara nodded, the memory of the vision searing behind her eyes. She had seen this moment, this flight into the unknown, but never had she imagined the face of the one who would stand beside her. They made their way down into the heart of the forest, a place that only those who carried ancient blood could traverse without fear. It was known as the Forest of Echoes, a labyrinth of silver-leaved trees and ivy-tangled paths that whispered the stories of those who had walked it before. Aelara's feet moved over familiar roots, the forest floor now shrouded in the soft golden hue of the morning. "Do you hear that?" Caleb's voice was low, and he stopped. His eyes darted through the dappled shadows as though listening for something beyond the wind. Aelara strained to hear, and then she caught it, a faint rustle and the distant sound of footsteps, light and deliberate. The forest was never silent, but this was different. This was the sound of something or someone following them. "Keep going," Aelara said, her voice tight. She wanted to keep moving, to get to safety before whatever was hunting them found them. But as the rustling grew closer, Caleb's arm shot out, stopping her. "We're not alone," he whispered. They were close now, the path narrowing between twisted trees and gnarled roots. The footsteps halted, and a new sound came, a voice, one that dripped with malice and familiarity. "So, the seer's chosen one finally shows her face again," it taunted. Aelara's heart sank. The voice belonged to Zyreth, her sister, the very one who had driven the High Council to cast her out. In the pale light, Aelara could see her sister's dark eyes gleaming like polished obsidian, framed by hair that shone like a raven's wing. Aelara's own vision had shown her this, but seeing Zyreth here, with that cruel smile twisted across her lips, made the vision suddenly real and terrifying. "Zyreth," Aelara said, her voice strained, as if saying the name out loud might undo the world. "Do you remember what I said to you that night, Aelara?" Zyreth stepped forward, the shadow of her form slicing through the dappled sunlight. "You were never meant to lead us. You're just a dreamer. A fool." "You're wrong," Aelara retorted, standing straighter. The whispers of doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind, but they were drowned out by the surge of courage that Caleb's presence had ignited within her. And you know it, Zyreth's smile faltered, just for an instant, before it hardened into a snarl. You have no idea what's at stake, sister. But you will. And when you do, you'll wish you had stayed silent. Aelara took a step forward, her voice quieter but resolute. It's not too late to turn back. To join me. To be part of the future, not the ruin. For a moment, the forest was deathly still, the only sound the wind sighing through the leaves. But then Zyreth laughed, a sound so harsh that even the trees seemed to shudder. Join you, she spat, her eyes now glowing with the dark magic that had set her apart from their kin. There is no future with you. There's only power, and I am its master now. With a snap of her fingers, the air rippled, charged with energy as dark as the night sky. Aelara's skin prickled, and Caleb raised his sword, his eyes locked on the threat before them. Caleb, go! Aelara shouted, stepping forward as if to shield him, to face the storm alone if she had to. But his arm shot out, holding her back. No, he said, his voice low. We face this together. Aelara felt a surge of gratitude, an ember of hope flaring to life within her. The darkness gathering around Zyreth was tangible, a living thing, but in that moment, Aelara knew something Zyreth didn't. That even in the face of impossible odds, they had something the dark elves and their twisted magic could never take away: each other. The first bolt of dark energy shot forward, a thread of shadow and wrath. Caleb met it with a flash of light, his sword glowing with the power of an ancient force unknown to Elora. The blast shattered through the air, and the clearing erupted in chaos, with echoes of the past meeting the battle cries of the present. Aelara, heart-pounding, summoned every ounce of strength. Her sister's face, once a beacon of love and now a mask of hatred, drove her forward. There was a battle to fight, and this time it wasn't just for survival. It was for the future. The forest roared with the clash of magic and steel, the sky above darkening as if to watch. And as they fought, one thing was certain. The fate of Elora had begun to shift, with both light and shadow vying for dominion. But in the center of it all, two figures stood side by side, defying the odds and whispering promises of a new dawn that might just be possible. The forest shook with a primal energy that seemed to split the very air. The clash of magic and steel, the shouts and cries, mingled with the voices of ancient trees, long used to witnessing the rising and falling of empires. The sky had turned a shade of stormy gray, as though the heavens themselves were torn between the battle of light and darkness below. Aelara's heart thumped in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum urging her on. A trail of fire seemed to carve itself through her veins, sparked by the presence of Caleb at her side. He fought with a fury she had never seen before, his sword a blur of silver and shadow. His every movement spoke of training, of years spent mastering the art of combat. But it was not just skill that made him formidable. It was the raw, unyielding spirit that drove him. Keep your focus, Caleb shouted over the din, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. He turned to deflect a bolt of dark energy aimed at Aelara, the force of it shattering the branches around them, sending leaves spiraling to the ground. Aelara's hands burned with power as she reached into the energy of the forest. The runes of the monolith, now etched in her memory, whispered to her, urging her to wield them. As she felt the ancient power coil within her, she raised her hands, and the air shimmered, taking on the hue of dawn's first light. A wave of energy swept outward, pushing back the dark elves and sending them scrambling for cover. The darkness that had pooled around Zyreth faltered, crackling and splintering like a shattered glass. You will regret this. Zyreth's voice rang out, sharp and seething, as she summoned another wave of shadow. Her eyes glowed with a light that was unnatural, a mark of her descent into the forbidden. The black tendrils lashed toward Aelara, aiming to choke the light from her. Not today, Aelara shouted, her voice strong as she countered with a surge of bright energy. The air erupted, light meeting dark in a storm of fire and smoke. She could feel the heat of it searing her skin, but it was a welcome pain, proof that she was alive, that she was fighting for more than just herself. Caleb's arm caught her waist, pulling her away from the vortex of dark energy. You need to stay grounded, Aelara. They feed on your fear. Don't let them have it. She nodded, tears of frustration and determination pooling at the corners of her eyes. He was right. She needed to be more than the frightened outcast who had run from her people's judgment. She needed to be the beacon that would light the way, the force that would push back the darkness threatening to consume them all. Zyreth's form shifted in the smoke, her voice deep and echoing, altered by whatever dark power coursed through her. You cannot save them, sister. They will fall to their own greed and madness, and so will you. The truth behind her words stung, but Aelara did not falter. It's not too late, Zyreth. It never is, she yelled, hoping to reach the sister she had once loved. But Zyreth's face twisted in rage. Enough! Zyreth bellowed. Her hand rose, and the shadow around her pulsed like a living thing, forming into a spear of darkness. It shot forward, fast and deadly, aimed straight at Aelara's heart. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the roar of battle. Caleb lunged forward, his sword catching the dark spear midair, shattering it into 1,000 shards of black light. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through the clearing, knocking Aelara and Caleb to the ground. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, the sounds of combat muted as if seen through water. Aelara's eyes widened as she watched Caleb struggle to his knees, his armor cracked and scorched. He was panting, the strain visible in the way his muscles tensed. He looked at her, eyes filled with fierce resolve, and for a moment, Aelara felt the weight of their shared fate settle over them both. Caleb, she started, but his hand silenced her as he reached out, gripping her arm with a strength that spoke of unyielding resolve. You're not alone, he said, voice steady despite the blood dripping from his brow. Not now, not ever. Before she could reply, the forest itself seemed to cry out. Aelara's vision blurred as the shadows around Zyreth thickened, churning with an unnatural life. The dark elves rallied, their twisted forms moving with an unholy grace, eyes burning with hatred. Their battle cries reverberated through the woods, and the ancient trees shivered as if recoiling from the corruption. Caleb, Aelara cried, fear making her voice tremble. Caleb stood, sword gripped tight, and nodded. Hold on to the light, Aelara. The dark can't swallow what it can't touch. The two charged forward, their movements synchronized as if they had fought side by side 1,000 times before. Aelara reached out to the forest's ancient power again, feeling the runes of the monolith respond to her touch, urging her to summon the force of the dawn. She was no longer just a princess exiled, or a seer who had been cast aside. She was the flame in the night, the hope that defied the darkness. As they reached Zyreth, a battle like no other unfolded. Caleb's blade met hers, and the clash sang through the forest, a symphony of steel and shadow. Aelara's power flared, spilling forth in waves of radiant energy. The clearing was ablaze with light and darkness, each clash, each breath, a question of who would emerge victorious. But then, just as Aelara thought the battle was at its peak, the shadow around Zyreth shifted. It grew, warping and pulsing, and in a voice that was no longer her own, it spoke. This is not the end. Aelara's heart stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and in that instant, she realized that Zyreth was not the only threat. Something more ancient, more powerful, lurked within the dark. And if they were to survive, they would have to face it together. Caleb, she screamed, and his eyes met hers, fierce and determined. Always, he replied. The battle had only just begun, but Aelara knew one thing for certain. The fate of Elora was about to change forever. The air crackled with a tension that threatened to shatter the world. Every heartbeat pounded in Aelara's chest like a drum, urging her forward, each breath caught between hope and dread. Caleb stood beside her, his gaze sharp and unyielding as he faced the shifting, roiling shadows. The dark elves' once pristine forms now seemed warped, as if the dark magic coursing through them had taken on a life of its own. Their eyes glowed a sickly green, reflecting an evil older than the forest itself. And in the center, Zyreth's face was a mask of rage and unholy power. "Look at what you've wrought, Aelara," Zyreth said, her voice no longer human, now carrying an inhuman echo. "I'm not alone anymore. I am Legion." Aelara's vision narrowed, seeing only the shadow that threatened to engulf everything she loved. The Monolith's runes, embedded deep in her mind, shone bright, their ancient language calling to her. She could feel the power thrumming through her veins like wildfire. But even that was not enough to combat the storm that Zyreth had unleashed. "Caleb," Aelara whispered, fear slipping in her voice, "we can't do this alone." Caleb's face softened for a moment, eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "We never have been alone," he said. "Remember that." He raised his sword, its blade now glowing with the same light that shone in her hands. The two forces met in a single, decisive charge. As they moved forward, the light from Aelara's power radiated out, illuminating the clearing with a fierce brilliance that pushed back the dark. The trees seemed to shiver and sway, as if exulting in the return of the light. The dark elves reeled, their twisted forms flinching from the searing brightness. Zyreth screamed, a sound so raw it could have torn the heavens apart. The dark shadows around her writhed, lashing out like vipers and forming a shield that pulsed and swelled, blocking their path. But Aelara's light, brighter and more fierce than ever, pierced through the darkness. "Caleb," Aelara called, thrusting her hands forward. The power surged out of her, breaking against Zyreth's shield like a tidal wave. The shadows flared, split, and in an instant, the dark energy that had sustained Zyreth collapsed, revealing the true form of her sister, hollow-eyed and trembling. "No," Zyreth gasped, her voice now weak, tinged with terror. "You howl." "We are the dawn," Aelara said, stepping forward with her eyes locked on the figure that had once been her sister. The remnants of her power crumbled around them, dissipating into a wisp of smoke. Caleb's sword lowered, the glow of it dimming as he stepped back, giving Aelara space. The shadows retreated, their shrieks fading into silence. The clearing, once a battleground, now held a fragile peace. Aelara reached for Zyreth, her heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and love. "It's over, Zyreth. The darkness you called is gone. Come back to us." Zyreth's eyes met hers, the flicker of recognition and pain there before they slid shut, and she crumbled to the ground, the last of the shadows slipping from her skin. Aelara caught her, the cold weight of her sister's body a silent reminder of what had almost been lost. The forest fell quiet, as if holding its breath, and Aelara felt the ancient power of the monolith fade, its light now tempered by the first true dawn in a long time. Aelara placed Zyreth down gently. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The High Council would know soon, and they would come to pass judgment on what had happened, on what the monolith had seen. But there was no fear in her now, no regret, just the knowledge that hope had won this day, and it was a victory they would not forget. "Thank you," Aelara said, turning to Caleb. Her voice cracked, the weight of their shared struggle heavy on her tongue. "I never thought I'd find a hero in a human." Caleb's smile was small but genuine, and it held the promise of things yet to come. "You always had one in me," he said, his voice low and certain. They stood there for a moment longer, the golden light of dawn illuminating them, as if the sun itself were blessing the beginning of a new era. The forest, now alive with the first sounds of spring, birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind, felt like a song of rebirth, of resilience. The monolith's runes had stopped glowing, but the memory of their light remained in Aelara's heart. "Let's go home," Aelara said, reaching for Caleb's hand. The two figures walked away from the clearing, leaving behind the echoes of what was, and stepping into the whispers of what could be. For the first time in centuries, Elora's future was theirs to shape. The dawn had come, and with it, the promise of peace.